My fiancé, Liam, always said there was something wrong with my family, but I never understood how wrong until my father died. We were in the dusty attic of my childhood home when I found it. Tucked inside my mother's old memory box was a thick yellowed envelope with a postmark dated a full year after the car crash that supposedly took her life. My hands trembled as I opened it and read the first line. My dearest Nora, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And your father has finally allowed you to know the truth. A cold dread washed over me as Liam put a hand on my shoulder. Nora? He whispered. And that's when 15 years of lies started to unravel. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. To understand the letter, you have to understand the 15 years that came before it. You have to understand the architecture of the lies my family was built on. I was 10 when my mother died. The story I was told was simple, brutal, and tragically believable. There was a slick road, a patch of black ice, and a single-car accident. It was instantaneous, my father said. She felt no pain. He was a master of the concise narrative, delivering devastating news with a chilling efficiency that left no room for questions. I remember the funeral being a blur of black clothes and hushed whispers. My father, David, played the part of the grieving widower perfectly. He was stoic, broken, but determined to be strong for his only daughter. The family, our aunts, uncles, and cousins, all rallied around this image of him. He was the tragic hero, and I was the sad, silent child he had to raise alone. The sympathy for him was a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered any questions I might have had. Kids are resilient, people would say, patting my head. But Nora, she has to be stronger now, for her father. That word, stronger, became the central pillar of my childhood. Every tear I shed was a disappointment, a sign I wasn't being strong enough. Every time I mentioned my mom, a sad, pained look would cross my father's face, a silent rebuke that taught me my grief was a burden to him. So, I learned to perform my own version of strength. I packed my grief away into a small, tight box in my chest, right next to the memories of my mother's laugh and the smell of her painting studio. Less than a year after the funeral, Susan arrived. She was introduced as a friend of a friend, a kind woman who was just there to help out around the house. She brought with her a son, Mark, who was a couple of years older than me. He was loud and confident, taking up space in our quiet, sad house in a way I never could. Susan was gentle at first, her voice soft, her hands always busy, tidying up the life my mother had left behind. She'd say things like, "Your father has been through so much, we need to take care of him." It all seemed so reasonable. Of course, he needed help. Of course, we needed to take care of him. I was a child, and I didn't have the language for the subtle invasion that was taking place. My mother's things began to disappear. First, the half-finished canvas on her easel was replaced by a sterile print of a sailboat, then her favorite coffee mug was gone from the cupboard. When I asked, my father would sigh and say, "Susan thought it was best. It's too painful to see these things every day, Nora. We have to move on. We have to be stronger." And so I accepted it. Each erasure was a lesson in being strong. Mark, on the other hand, was praised for his resilience, his ability to fit in seamlessly. He was the golden child, the symbol of our new, blended family's success. I was the relic of the past, the somber reminder of the tragedy they were all so desperate to move on from. The dynamic was set within months. My father, the grieving hero. Susan, the patient saint. Mark, the well-adjusted son. And me, the difficult, moody daughter who just couldn't let go of the past. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, and I was its most dedicated student, spending the next 15 years trying to earn an A. The house, once a place of warmth and creativity, slowly transformed under Susan's quiet and methodical reign. It was a campaign of attrition against my mother's memory. Susan never did anything overt or dramatic. Her methods were far more insidious, like a slow-acting poison. It was all done under the guise of care and consideration for my father's fragile emotional state. The vibrant, colourful paintings my mother had hung on the walls were taken down one by one, replaced with beige landscapes and impersonal family portraits of this new family unit. with me awkwardly photoshopped into a group shot with Susan and Mark. When I once found the courage to ask where my mother's paintings had gone, Susan gave me a pitying look, the kind you give a confused animal. "Oh, honey," she'd said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We put them in storage. It was just too hard for your father to look at them. You understand, don't you? We have to protect him." It was a brilliant tactic, framing the erasure of my mother as an act of love for my father. How could a 10-year-old girl argue with that? How could I say that my need to see my mother's art was more important than my father's grief? I couldn't, so I said nothing. Mark, the golden child, was given my mother's old art studio as his new bedroom. It was the largest room in the house, with beautiful north-facing windows that filled it with light. He covered the walls where her canvases once hung with posters of cars and rock bands. The faint, sweet smell of oil paint and turpentine that I loved so much was quickly overpowered by the scent of stale pizza and teenage boy. When I cried about it, my father sat me down for a serious talk. "Nora," he said, his voice laced with disappointment, "you're being selfish. Mark needs his own space. This is his home now, too. Your mother would have wanted us to be a happy family." The phrase "your mother would have wanted" became his favorite weapon. It was the ultimate trump card, a way to sanctify any decision he and Susan made. My mother would have wanted them to take extravagant vacations while I stayed home. My mother would have wanted Mark to get a new car for his 16th birthday, while I was told to get a job to pay for my own. My mother, the silent, dead martyr, was posthumously co-signing every act of favoritism and neglect. They would talk about her occasionally, but only in ways that served their narrative. They'd tell stories about how clumsy she was, or how she was a terrible cook, small, dismissive anecdotes that chipped away at the vibrant, brilliant woman I remembered. They were reshaping her into someone more convenient, someone who would have undoubtedly approved of Susan's superior housekeeping and Mark's charming ambition. My grief was an inconvenience, a stubborn stain they couldn't quite scrub out. On the anniversary of her death, I would want to visit her grave, and they would sigh and say, "Is that really necessary?" It's important to look forward, not back. Family gatherings became a performance. I was expected to smile, to call Susan Mum, a word that felt like acid on my tongue, and to pretend that this new configuration was not just a replacement, but an improvement. The family motto, often repeated by Susan, was, "We don't air our dirty laundry in public." This was code for, "You will not speak of your sadness. You will not question our authority. You will not make anyone uncomfortable with your inconvenient emotions." And I obeyed, because I was a child who had already lost one parent, and the terrifying thought of losing the other one, of being completely alone, was enough to ensure my silence for a very, very long time. Growing up was a masterclass in self-sufficiency, born not out of a desire for independence, but out of sheer necessity. While Mark's life was a series of wants fulfilled, mine was a ledger of needs ignored. He wanted a new gaming console, and it would appear for his half-birthday. He wanted to go on a ski trip with his friends, and my father and Susan would eagerly fund it, calling it a character-building experience. My needs were far simpler. I needed new glasses, and I was told to make my old pair last another year. I needed help with tuition for a summer program, and I was advised to get a part-time job because work builds character. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. Mark's character was built with cash and indulgence, while mine was forged in the fires of financial neglect. The double standard was the very air I breathed in that house. I started working at a local diner when I was 16, the greasy smell of fries clinging to my clothes and hair. I saved every penny, not for a car or for clothes, but for an escape. College was my only goal, a distant shore where I could finally be my own person. When I got my acceptance letter, I showed it to my father with a rare flicker of hope. For a moment I thought he'd be proud. He looked at the letter, then at me, and said, "That's a good school. Expensive, though. How are you planning on paying for it?" There was no offer of help, no congratulations. Just a pragmatic, dismissive question that put the entire burden squarely on my shoulders. I worked 2 jobs all through college, waitressing on weeknights and working retail on weekends. I lived on instant noodles and cheap coffee. Meanwhile, the calls from home were frequent and always, without fail, about money. It was never a, "How are you, Nora? How are your classes?" It was always a crisis, a new financial fire that only I could put out. Mark had a brilliant new business idea, a can't-miss opportunity, but he was just a little short on capital. "It's what your mother would have wanted, Nora," my father would say, his voice a practiced blend of hope and emotional blackmail. For family to support family. The first few times, I believed him. I was conditioned to be the responsible one, the family fixer. I'd wire them money from my meager savings, money that was supposed to be for my textbooks or my rent, feeling a sick mix of resentment and duty. I was buying their affection, or at least their temporary approval. It was a terrible transaction. I was the family's designated driver at a demolition derby, expected to stay sober and responsible while they crashed and burned with gleeful abandon, and then to pay for the damages afterward. Each time I sent money, the gnawing feeling that something was fundamentally wrong grew stronger. It felt like I was pouring water into a bucket full of holes, and I was the only one who seemed to notice we were still in a desert. My attempts to discuss this, to voice my financial strain, were always met with the same gaslighting tactics. "You're being so dramatic, Nora," Susan would say with a sigh. "It's just a little bit of money. We're a family, we help each other." Or my father would turn it around on me. "I'm surprised at your attitude. After everything we've done for you." What they had done for me was provide a roof over my head and food on the table, the bare minimum of parental responsibility. And they wielded it like a king's ransom I could never repay. I was trapped in a cycle of financial and emotional exploitation, and for the longest time, I saw no way out. The fog of my family's dysfunction started to lift, slowly at first, the year I met Liam. He was a graduate student in the architecture department, and we met in a shared library workspace. He was calm, observant, and had a quiet confidence that I found both intimidating and incredibly comforting. For the first time in my life, I was with someone who listened more than they talked. He would ask me questions about my life, my family, and he would actually listen to the answers, his brow furrowing when I'd recount some new demand from my father, or another of Mark's emergencies. He didn't just hear the words, he heard the spaces in between them, the things I wasn't saying. Initially, I presented my family in the best possible light. I used the script I had been given. My dad was a strong, grieving widower. Susan was his supportive wife, and Mark was just a bit lost, trying to find his way. It was the story I had told myself for so long that I almost believed it. Liam never challenged it directly. He would just ask simple, clarifying questions. After I told him about sending Mark another $500 for a website development course, Liam looked at me and asked, "And did he ever show you the website he built?" The question was so simple, yet it stopped me in my tracks. Of course he hadn't. There was no website. There never was. Liam was the first person to notice the transactional nature of their calls. He was there one evening when my father called. I put it on speakerphone, thinking it would be a normal conversation. But the first words out of my father's mouth were, "Nora, we need to talk. Mark's car broke down and the mechanic says it's the transmission." I went through the usual motions, my stomach tightening with anxiety. Liam sat quietly, just watching me. After I hung up, having promised to see what I could spare, Liam looked at me, his expression serious. "He didn't ask you how your final exams went," he said. It was a simple observation, a statement of fact, but it hit me like a physical blow. He was right. My father hadn't asked about my life, my stresses, my triumphs. The call was a transaction, a means to an end. Liam was an outsider, an impartial observer who saw the play for what it was, not the carefully constructed drama I had been forced to star in my whole life. He gave me the vocabulary for what I was experiencing. He introduced me to words like gaslighting and emotional manipulation. He told me about the golden child and scapegoat dynamic. It was like someone had handed me a dictionary for my own life, and suddenly all the confusing, painful experiences began to make a terrifying kind of sense. The most powerful thing he ever said to me during that time was after a particularly nasty call with Susan, who had berated me for not being enthusiastic enough about Mark's latest get-rich-quick scheme. I was crying, not out of sadness, but out of sheer, helpless frustration. Liam held my hand and said, with a certainty that anchored me, "Nora, the way they talk to you isn't normal. It's not your fault. To have my reality validated for the first time was like a dam breaking. The years of suppressed anger, of being told I was too sensitive or too dramatic, came flooding out. He didn't try to fix it. He just sat with me, a calm, steady presence against the storm of my family's making. He was the anchor that finally gave me the strength to stop drifting and start questioning where the current was taking me. The first time I said no, it felt less like a word and more like a declaration of war. The catalyst, as always, was Mark. He had a revolutionary new idea, a bespoke artisanal dog food delivery service. It required, of course, a significant initial investment for a commercial kitchen lease and a branded delivery van. The call came from my father on a Tuesday evening. I was at my apartment with Liam, studying for a major exam. My father's voice was full of that false, manufactured excitement he used when he was about to ask for a large sum of money. He went on and on about market research and profit margins, words he was clearly just repeating from Mark. Then came the ask. $5,000. It was an absurd amount, more money than I had in my entire bank account. In the past, I would have panicked. I would have calculated what I could sell, which bills I could postpone, how many extra shifts I could pick up. I would have drained my savings and felt sick about it for weeks. But this time was different. Liam was sitting across from me, his expression calm and supportive. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the encouragement I needed. "I can't," I said. The words felt foreign in my mouth, heavy and sharp. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. I don't think my father had ever heard that word from me before. "What do you mean, you can't?" he finally asked, his voice laced with disbelief and a rising tide of anger. "I mean, I don't have it, and even if I did, I wouldn't give it to him. It's not a viable business, Dad. It never is." I was surprised by my own firmness. Liam's quiet validation over the past few months had built a spine in me I didn't know I possessed. The fallout was instantaneous. My father's manufactured charm evaporated, replaced by cold fury. "I can't believe how selfish you've become, Nora," he spat. "Family is supposed to help each other. What would your mother think of you now, hoarding your money while your brother is trying to build a future?" He hung up on me. It was like a switch had been flipped. The loving father persona was gone, and in his place was a bitter, entitled man who had just been denied his due. The next phase of the assault came via text message from Susan. Her approach was different, more manipulative. "Your father is so hurt by your attitude. We are all just so disappointed. You've changed, Nora. You used to be such a sweet, giving girl." She was trying to activate the guilt, the trigger that had worked flawlessly for over a decade, but for the first time it didn't work. Instead of guilt, I felt a surge of white-hot anger. They weren't disappointed in me, they were disappointed that the ATM was out of service. Mark even tried calling, leaving a whiny, passive-aggressive voicemail about how he thought he could count on me, his only sister. The coordinated attack lasted for days. It was a full-scale emotional siege. They were trying to break me down, to force me back into my designated role as the family financier and emotional punching bag. But standing my ground, for the very first time, was terrifyingly empowering. It was a taste of freedom, a realization that their power over me was entirely contingent on my compliance. Saying no didn't just save me $5,000, it saved a piece of my soul. It was the first brick I laid in a new foundation, a boundary that declared my life, my money, and my future were finally my own. After the financial well ran dry, a new and far more insidious form of manipulation began to surface: my father's health. It started subtly. A few weeks after the dog food business debacle, Susan called to tell me my father was feeling under the weather. It was just a cold, she said, but he was taking it very hard. The implication was clear. His fragile health was my fault, a direct result of the stress I had caused by saying no. I offered the appropriate level of sympathy, but I didn't offer money, and I didn't rush home. A week later, the mysterious ailments escalated. He had developed a persistent cough, then debilitating back pain. According to Susan's increasingly dramatic reports, he was wasting away. "The doctor can't figure out what it is," she'd say in a hushed, conspiratorial tone. "They want to run more tests, but you know how insurance is. They won't cover any of it. The out-of-pocket costs are just staggering." It was a transparent ploy, a pathetic, see-through attempt to guilt me into opening my wallet again. They had traded emotional blackmail for medical blackmail. This was a new level of desperation, and it was as disgusting as it was predictable. Liam, my voice of reason, called it for what it was. "It's a classic tactic," he said, scrolling through an article on his phone about toxic family systems. "When manipulation fails, they escalate to feigning crisis. They're trying to find a new lever to pull." He was right. With his help, I developed a new strategy. I wouldn't ignore them, as that would only feed their narrative of me as the cruel, ungrateful daughter. Instead, I would offer practical, non-financial solutions. When Susan called complaining about the cost of a specialist, I spent an entire afternoon researching doctors in their network. I emailed her a list of 3 highly rated, fully covered specialists. "Here," I wrote. "These doctors should be able to help, and it won't cost you a thing." Her response was telling. There was no thank you, only a curt reply. "That's not the point, Nora." Of course it wasn't. The point wasn't getting my father better. The point was getting my money. Another time, my father called me himself, his voice weak and raspy, to tell me about a new experimental treatment he'd read about. It was expensive, naturally. I listened patiently and then said, "That sounds interesting, Dad. Send me the research papers on it. I'd be happy to read through them and help you weigh the pros and cons." He stammered, caught off guard. "Oh, well, I don't have them handy," he mumbled. The subject was never brought up again. My refusal to play their game, to simply write a check, infuriated them. My offers of genuine help were an insult because they exposed their lie. They didn't want solutions, they wanted submission. The sicker my father supposedly became, the angrier their calls grew. They accused me of being cold, heartless, of abandoning him in his time of need. The truth was, I was abandoning their script, their carefully crafted play where I was cast as the ever-giving, ever-gullible daughter. I was no longer playing my part, and it was driving the rest of the cast mad. This period was a crucial test of my new boundaries. It was hard to listen to a parent talk about being sick and not feel a pang of guilt. But Liam helped me see that my guilt was a conditioned response, a button they had installed in me as a child. Learning not to press it was one of the hardest and most important things I ever did. I was detaching with logic, refusing to be drawn into their manufactured drama. I didn't know it then, but this battle of wills was just a prelude to the much larger war that was to come. The final act of my father's life was as riddled with manipulation as all the years that preceded it. The call came from Susan one morning. Her voice was flat and devoid of emotion, which was more chilling than any feigned hysteria. He was gone. A heart attack in his sleep, she said. It was sudden, peaceful. My own reaction was a confusing cocktail of emotions. There was a flicker of the grief a daughter is supposed to feel, a sadness for the father he could have been. But the dominant feeling was a profound, unsettling sense of relief. It felt like a heavy weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted from my shoulders. The funeral was a surreal performance. Susan played the grieving widow, and Mark the supportive son. Relatives who I hadn't seen in years hugged me and told me how proud my father was of me, a statement so laughably false it was almost comical. I just nodded and accepted their condolences, a silent observer at my own father's play. The real drama, however, began at the reading of the will. We all gathered at a stuffy lawyer's office. Susan and Mark were practically vibrating with anticipation. They had been talking for weeks about selling the house, about the grand plans they had for the inheritance. They assumed everything would go to them, with perhaps a token amount left for me to keep up appearances. The lawyer, a grim-faced man named Mr. Abernathy, cleared his throat and began to read. The will was shockingly simple. All of my father's liquid assets, his savings, investments, and retirement accounts were to be split evenly between Susan and Mark. There was a tense moment as they waited for the other shoe to drop. And then it did. The house and all of its contents were left solely and entirely to me, Nora. The silence in the room was deafening. I could feel the heat of Susan's glare on the side of my face. Mark just stared at the lawyer, his mouth hanging slightly open. "That's it?" Mark finally blurted out, his voice cracking with disbelief. "She gets the house? The whole thing?" Mr. Abernathy simply nodded. The language is quite clear. Susan found her voice then, a low, dangerous hiss. That house is worth a fortune. We were supposed to sell it, David promised. The lawyer just shrugged, unmoved. Whatever he may have promised you verbally is irrelevant. This is his final, legally binding testament. They were furious. Their faces were masks of pure, unfiltered rage. They had been so certain of their victory, so sure that their years of sycophantic behavior had paid off. Leaving me the house was my father's last, and most confusing act. I couldn't figure out his motive. Was it a final, bizarre act of paternal love? A last-ditch effort to reconnect with the daughter he had pushed away? Or was it something else entirely? Perhaps it was his ultimate act of control, a way to force me back into the family home, to tie me to a past I was so desperate to escape. Or maybe, and this thought was the most chilling, he was simply trying to create chaos from beyond the grave, pitting me against Susan and Mark one last time. Whatever his reason, it set the stage for our final confrontation. The house was now my property, my responsibility. And in order to move forward, I would have to go back and sift through the wreckage of the past he had left behind for me. Cleaning out the house felt like an archaeological dig into my own dysfunctional history. Every object held a memory, most of them tainted. Liam took a week off work to help, a silent, steady presence in the emotional minefield. Susan and Mark were of course a constant, circling threat. They couldn't legally stop me from taking possession of the house, but they made their displeasure known. They would show up unannounced, demanding to be let in to retrieve some imagined heirloom they suddenly couldn't live without. "Your father promised me that grandfather clock," Susan would insist, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger. "I have no recollection of that," I'd reply calmly, blocking the doorway. My newfound spine was getting a thorough workout. The most contentious area was the attic. It was the one part of the house Susan had never bothered to colonize. To her, it was just a dark, dusty space full of junk. To me, it was the last untouched corner of my mother's life. My father had always forbidden me from going up there. "It's not safe," he'd say. Full of rusty nails and spiders. It was, of course, just another lie. Liam and I spent an entire Saturday in that attic. It was hot and smelled of old paper and cedar. We sorted through boxes of my old-school projects, holiday decorations, and my father's military service records. It was mostly mundane, a lifetime of accumulated clutter. I was about to suggest we break for lunch when my foot hit something solid under a pile of old drop cloths. It was a heavy wooden footlocker, the kind soldiers use. It wasn't my father's. His was in the garage. This one was older. I brushed away a thick layer of dust and saw a small brass nameplate. On it, in elegant tarnished script, was my mother's maiden name, Eleanor Vance. My breath caught in my throat. I had never seen this box before. "Liam," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He came over, his eyes wide. The lock was old and rusted, but it wasn't latched. With a creak of protest, I lifted the heavy lid. The inside was packed with things I recognized instantly, things I thought had been lost forever. My mother's art supplies, her favorite charcoal pencils, a stack of her sketchbooks filled with drawings of me as a little girl. Tucked in the corner was her old jewelry box. And resting right on top of a pile of old photographs was a thick, yellowed envelope. It was addressed to me, Nora, in my mother's familiar, looping handwriting. But it was the postmark that made my blood run cold. It was from a small town in Oregon, a state my mother had never even visited, to my knowledge. And the date was stamped clearly, October 14th, 2009, a full year after she had supposedly died. My heart was hammering against my ribs. It felt like the attic was shrinking, the air growing thin. I pulled out the letter, my fingers numb and clumsy. It felt heavy, filled with years of unsaid words. This was it. This was the source of that feeling, that deep, gut-wrenching wrongness I had felt for 15 years. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a fact, it was a lie. I opened the flap and read the first sentence, and the entire foundation of my life crumbled into dust. "My dearest Nora, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and your father has finally allowed you to know the truth. Or, more likely, it means he is gone and you've found this by some miracle. I pray it's the latter. I had to read the words 3 times before they would fit into my brain. The world tilted on its axis. Liam read the sentence over my shoulder, and I felt his hand grip mine, a warm anchor in a suddenly freezing universe. I sank down onto the dusty floorboards of the attic, the letter trembling in my hand. I read the rest of it aloud, my voice a strange, cracking monotone that didn't sound like my own. My mother's words, her real words, filled the silent, forgotten space. There was no car crash, there was no black ice. There was only a lie, a monstrous, cruel, and meticulously crafted lie. My father, the man who had played the tragic widower for 15 years, was not a victim, he was a monster. The letter explained that their marriage, which I remembered in hazy, sun-drenched fragments, had been a cage for her. He was controlling, possessive, and emotionally abusive in ways a child could never see. He didn't hit her, she wrote, but he suffocated her, chipping away at her confidence, isolating her from her friends, and belittling her art, the one thing that was truly hers. She had tried to leave him multiple times, but he always manipulated her into staying, usually by using me as a pawn. He'd tell her she was a terrible mother for wanting to break up the family, that she would ruin my life. But finally, she found the courage. She had a plan, a place to go, a friend waiting for her. She sat me down that last morning and told me she loved me more than anything in the world, a memory I had clung to for years without understanding its true significance. When she told my father she was leaving for good, he didn't beg or plead. He revealed the true darkness of his character. He gave her a chilling ultimatum. She could walk away, disappear completely, and never contact me again. In return, he would raise me, provide for me, and I would have a stable life. But if she fought him, if she tried for custody, he would make her life a living hell. He would drag my name through the mud, paint her as an unstable, unfit mother, and he would poison me against her. And then he delivered his final, checkmate move. He told her that if she pushed him, he would take me and disappear where she would never, ever find us. She believed him. She wrote that she looked into his eyes and saw that he was not bluffing. He was a man capable of anything when his control was threatened. So she was forced to make an impossible choice: fight for me and risk losing me forever in the crossfire, or leave me to what she prayed would be a safe, albeit motherless, life. She chose to leave. She chose what she thought was my safety over her own happiness. The story of the car crash was his invention, a perfect, airtight narrative that would garner him endless sympathy and cement his control over me and my memory of her. He had killed her in the only way he could, by erasing her from my life and replacing her with a ghost. The weight of this revelation was crushing. It wasn't just a lie, it was the theft of a life, the theft of my mother. She had been alive all this time, and I hadn't known. I had been grieving a woman who was out there somewhere, grieving me right back. The single letter was just the beginning. The wooden footlocker was a time capsule, a secret museum of my mother's exiled life. Beneath the first letter was a thick stack of others, all in her handwriting, all addressed to me. There was one for every birthday, every Christmas, for 15 years. They were all unopened, their seals unbroken. My father hadn't even bothered to read them. He had simply hidden them away, erasing her attempts to reach me as completely as he had erased her from the house. Liam and I sat there on the attic floor for hours, and I opened them one by one, in chronological order. I was rebuilding my mother and my own life, letter by letter. The first few were filled with a raw, agonizing pain. She wrote about the hollow ache of my first birthday without her, about how she'd bought a cake and blown out the candles alone, wishing for me. She described her new life in Oregon, living under a new name, her maiden name, Eleanor Vance. She worked as a graphic designer, a practical use for her artistic talent. She lived in a small apartment with a view of the mountains. It was a lonely, quiet life, a self-imposed witness protection program. As the years went on, the tone of the letters shifted. The raw pain was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface, but it was joined by a fierce, protective love. She had found ways to keep track of me. She had a friend back home who would send her my school photos, clippings from the local paper, if my name was ever mentioned for being on the honor roll. She knew I was on the high school debate team. She knew I had gotten into my first choice university. She was a ghost, watching from the wings of my life. "I saw a picture of you from your prom, my darling Nora," one letter read. "You wore a blue dress. You were so beautiful, you took my breath away. You have my eyes, but you have your own strength. I can see it." In another box, I found all those school photos, the ones Susan had lost. My mother had kept them, treasured them. The letters weren't just updates, they were her attempt to still be my mother. She gave me advice I had so desperately needed as a teenager. She told me stories about her own family, my grandparents, who I had been told died when I was a baby, another lie. She filled in the vast, empty spaces of my history. And then there was the final revelation, the one that showed the depth of her planning and her unwavering hope. In the letter written around my 18th birthday, she explained that she had been saving money from the very beginning. She had opened a trust fund in my name, under a secure account that my father knew nothing about. It wasn't a huge fortune, she wrote, but it was enough for a fresh start. It was her final gift, a key to unlock a future free from my father's control. The trust would become fully accessible to me on my 30th birthday. The last letter was different. The handwriting was a little shakier. She wrote that she had been diagnosed with cancer a year prior. She had fought it, but it was aggressive. She knew she was running out of time. This letter, the one I had found first, was her last will and testament, her final confession. She explained she was sending it to a lawyer she had hired, with strict instructions for it to be delivered to me upon the confirmation of my father's death. But it seemed my father, ever the puppet master, had managed to intercept even this final message, hiding it away with all the others, determined to take his secrets to the grave. My mother had died for real only 2 years ago. I had lost her twice, once to a lie, and once to the truth. The grief was immense, a fresh, gaping wound. But beneath the grief, something else was stirring. A cold, hard, and righteous anger. My father hadn't just lied to me. He had stolen my mother's last years, her final messages of love. He had stolen my chance to know her, to talk to her, to say goodbye. And Susan and Mark, they had to have known. This wasn't a secret one man could keep alone in a house full of people. They were complicit, and I was going to burn their world to the ground. Armed with a truth that felt as heavy and as dangerous as a loaded gun, I walked down from the attic. Each step on the creaking wooden stairs was deliberate, a drumbeat marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. Liam was right behind me, a silent, solid shadow of support. He carried the wooden footlocker, the physical evidence of my stolen past. My grief was momentarily eclipsed by a cold, crystalline rage. The confusion and sadness had coalesced into a single, sharp point of purpose. I knew exactly what I had to do. I found them in the living room, exactly where I knew they would be. They were bickering over an antique silver tea set, their voices a low, greedy hum. Susan was polishing a teapot with the sleeve of her blouse, her expression pinched with avarice. Mark was looking up its value on his phone, his face lit by the screen's glow. They were vultures, picking over the bones of a life, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break over their heads. They didn't even look up when I entered. They were too engrossed in their petty squabble. I stood there for a moment, just watching them. I saw them for what they truly were, not family, but parasites, small, selfish people who had attached themselves to my father's darkness and thrived in it. The 15 years of tiptoeing around their moods, of swallowing my own feelings to keep the peace, of shrinking myself to make them comfortable, it was all over. I placed the yellowed letter, my mother's final testament, on the coffee table between them. The sound made them both jump. They looked up, their faces a mixture of annoyance and surprise at the interruption. "What's this?" Susan asked, her voice sharp. "More junk from the attic." "It's a letter," I said, my own voice eerily calm. I had expected to be shaking, to be screaming, but I felt a strange and powerful serenity. It was the calm of absolute certainty. "It's from my mother," Mark snorted. "Right. Sent via ghost post?" Susan just stared at the envelope, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Was it fear? Recognition? I didn't give them time to formulate a defense. I didn't accuse. I didn't yell. I simply asked a question. A single, devastating question that I already knew the answer to. I looked directly into Susan's eyes, holding her gaze, refusing to let her look away. "You knew," I said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. You knew she was alive all this time, didn't you? The color drained from her face. Her carefully constructed mask of the patient, supportive wife shattered into a million pieces. For a split second, I saw pure, unadulterated panic in her eyes. It was all the confirmation I needed. The war had begun. Susan's first instinct was to lie, to fall back on the gaslighting tactics that had been her primary language for 15 years. She let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound completely devoid of humor. "Nora, what on earth are you talking about?" she said, her voice a little too high, a little too brittle. "The grief is making you delusional. Your mother died. It was a tragedy. We all lived through it." She reached for the letter, but I snatched it away before her fingers could touch it. "Don't," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare touch it." Mark, ever the opportunist, chimed in, trying to play the role of the concerned stepbrother. "Seriously, Nora, you're scaring us. Maybe you should sit down. Maybe we should call someone." The condescension in his voice was like gasoline on a fire. They were trying to paint me as hysterical, as unstable. It was their classic move, the one they used every time I had ever tried to voice a feeling or a complaint that made them uncomfortable. But this time, I had proof. I had an arsenal. "I'm not grieving, Susan," I said, my eyes still locked on hers. "I'm angry. I'm angry because I spent half my life mourning a woman who was alive. A woman who sent me letters that you and my father hid from me." I opened the footlocker that Liam had placed on the floor beside me. I reached in and pulled out a handful of the unopened envelopes, the birthday cards, the Christmas letters. I threw them on the coffee table. They scattered across the polished wood like dead leaves. "What about these?" I demanded. "Are these a product of my delusional grief too?" Susan stared at the pile of letters, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She had no answer. The evidence was irrefutable. But it was Mark who broke first. He wasn't as practiced a liar as his mother. He looked from the letters to me, his usual smug confidence replaced by a shifty, cornered animal nervousness. He knew the game was up. I picked up a letter at random. It was from my 11th birthday. I opened it and began to read aloud. "My darling Nora, today you are 11. I bet you're almost as tall as me now. I remember when we went to the old carousel at the state fair, and you insisted on riding the purple horse with the chipped ear. You named him Stardust. You rode him 5 times, and you cried when we had to leave." I stopped reading and looked up. Susan was pale, but Mark's face was a mask of shock. It was a small, specific memory. A memory there was no way my father would have known or cared enough to invent. It was a direct transmission from my mother's heart to mine, a message that had been intercepted and hidden for more than a decade. The truth was out, lying there between us in the silent living room, and their pathetic, desperate lies had nowhere left to hide. The facade had not just cracked, it had been utterly demolished. The confession, when it finally came, was not a remorseful torrent of guilt. It was a slow, resentful trickle of poison. Susan, seeing that denial was no longer an option, switched tactics from gaslighting to self-victimization. She sank onto the sofa, placing a hand over her heart in a gesture of faux distress. "You have to understand," she began, her voice quivering with manufactured emotion. "When I met your father, he was a broken man. He was so lost, so devastated. She was trying to recast the villain as a tragic hero, a man driven to desperate measures by love and loss. I just stared at her, my face a mask of stone. I refused to give her the sympathy she was so desperately seeking. He told me everything," she continued, tears now welling in her eyes. "It was a masterful performance. He told me the truth about Eleanor. He was so afraid of losing you, Nora. He did what he did out of love. A twisted kind of love, maybe, but love nonetheless. She was trying to sell me a narrative where my father's monstrous cruelty was just a misguided act of paternal devotion. According to her story, she was just a compassionate woman who had fallen in love with a damaged man and had sworn to protect his dark secret. It was a bond between them, she claimed, a shared burden. She admitted to seeing the letters arrive, year after year. She said it broke her heart, but she had to protect David. He would get so agitated every time one of them came, she whispered. It was like reopening the wound. Hiding them was the only way to keep the peace, to keep our family stable. There it was, that word again. Peace. The family peace that I was always responsible for maintaining, the peace that was contingent upon my silence, my compliance, my ignorance. Her version of peace was a lie-infested swamp, and she was angry at me for wanting to drain it. There was no apology. There was no remorse for the 15 years of my life that had been built on a lie, for the mother I had been stolen from. Her confession was laced with indignation, as if I were the one in the wrong for digging up a past that was better left buried. She was not sorry for what she did, she was sorry she got caught. "We gave you a good life, Nora," she said, her voice gaining a sharp, defensive edge. "You had a home, you had everything you needed. Everything except a mother. Everything except the truth." Her confession was the ultimate act of gaslighting, an attempt to reframe her complicity as a noble sacrifice. She wasn't just a participant in the lie, she was its primary architect and enforcer, the one who had diligently hidden every single piece of evidence, the one who had taught me to call her Mum while my real mother was alive and heartbroken, 1,000 miles away. Her tears were not for me, or for the mother I had lost. They were for herself, for the comfortable, fraudulent life that was now crumbling around her. Just when I thought the depths of their depravity had been reached, Mark decided to reveal a final, disgusting layer of betrayal. While Susan was spinning her tale of misguided love and protection, Mark had been silent, his face a sullen mask. But my cold, unrelenting stare eventually shifted to him. He was not an innocent bystander in this. He was a teenager when this all started. He had lived in this house of lies for years. "And what about you, Mark?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "When did you find out?" He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," he mumbled, the default response of a coward. "Oh, I think you do," I pressed. "You were always snooping around, always looking for things. You're telling me you lived in this house for over a decade and never once stumbled upon my mother's secret." That's when a slow, ugly smirk spread across his face. It was the most honest expression I had seen from him all day. The fear was gone, replaced by a familiar, arrogant cruelty. "I found them when I was 16, he said, his voice dripping with a casual pride that made my stomach turn. "I was looking for Dad's old stamp collection in the attic, thought I could sell it. Found the box of letters instead." He said it so nonchalantly, as if he were recounting finding a box of old magazines. He admitted that he had read them all. He knew the entire story. He knew my mother was alive. He knew about her pain. He knew about the lies. He had known the truth for almost 10 years. "And you didn't think to tell me?" I asked, my voice trembling with a fresh wave of rage. His smirk widened. "And why would I do that?" he asked, a genuine sociopathic curiosity in his question. Things were good. I had Mum and David wrapped around my finger. Every time I needed a new car, or some cash for a trip, or an investment for one of my brilliant ideas, all I had to do was mention the Oregon situation. They would do anything to keep me quiet. The air left my lungs. It wasn't just complicity, it was leverage. He had used my mother's pain, my stolen life, as a bargaining chip for his own selfish, petty desires. He had been blackmailing his own mother and stepfather for a decade. The money I had sent, the sacrifices I had made for his business ventures, were all funded by his silence. He was a parasite feeding on the original lie. The disgust I felt was profound. It was a physical sensation, a wave of nausea. He wasn't just a golden child who had been spoiled and favored. He was rotten to the core. He saw my pain, my entire life's tragedy, as a business opportunity. He had the power to end my suffering with a single sentence, and instead, he chose to profit from it. There was no remorse in his confession. There was only pride. He was proud of his cleverness, of the power he held over them. He was a monster that my father's original lie had created, nurtured by Susan's desperate need to maintain her fraudulent family unit. He was the truest product of that toxic home. In that moment, I realized that I had never really known these people at all. They weren't my family. They were a collection of strangers bound together by a shared dark secret, and they would have let me live my entire life in the dark if it meant preserving their comfortable, hollow existence. There was nothing left to say. The truth, in all its ugly, horrifying detail, was out. The living room was thick with the stench of their confessions. Susan was still weeping her false, self-pitying tears. Mark was looking at me with a defiant, smug expression, as if daring me to be shocked by his monstrosity. I looked at them, at the two people who had actively participated in the theft of my life, and I felt nothing. The anger, the grief, the shock, it all receded, replaced by a vast, cold emptiness. They were nothing to me. "Get out," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a judge passing sentence. Susan looked up, her tear-streaked face a mask of disbelief. "What?" "Nora, this is our home." "No," I said, shaking my head slowly. "This was my mother's home. Then it was my father's home. And now, according to his will, it is now my home. And you are no longer welcome in it." The finality of my words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Susan's mouth snapped shut, her feigned tears drying instantly, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated fury. She rose from the sofa, her posture rigid with indignation. "You can't be serious," she hissed, the mask of the grieving widow completely gone, revealing the grasping, entitled woman beneath. "We have lived here for 15 years. This is our home. You can't just throw us out onto the street." Mark, ever her echo, jumped to his feet as well. "She's right. We have rights. You can't just kick us out. We'll get a lawyer." The irony was so staggering it was almost funny. They were appealing to the law, to rights, after having participated in a 15-year conspiracy that had stripped me of the most fundamental right a child has, the right to their own parent. "Your rights ended the moment you became complicit in hiding my mother from me," I said, my voice as cold and hard as marble. "You are not tenants. You are not family. You are guests whose welcome has expired. You have 1 hour to pack a bag with your essentials. Then I want you gone." Liam stood silently by the door, a solid presence that communicated he was prepared to enforce my decision. His quiet strength was my backstop. Susan let out a derisive snort. "An hour? Don't be ridiculous, Nora. We're not going anywhere." She crossed her arms, a defiant statue of self-interest. Mark mirrored her stance, a smug look on his face. They thought it was a negotiation. They thought I was still the same pliable, conflict-averse girl who would eventually buckle under pressure to keep the peace. They had fundamentally miscalculated. They didn't realize that the girl they had raised no longer existed. She had died in that dusty attic, right alongside the ghost of her mother she had been forced to mourn. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply pulled out my phone. "Fine," I said, dialing 3 numbers. "You have a right to stay here until you are legally compelled to leave. Let's expedite that process." Susan's eyes widened in panic as she realized who I was calling. "You wouldn't," she breathed, the bravado evaporating. "Watch me," I replied, and as the dispatcher's voice came on the line, I said calmly and clearly, "Hello, I need to report a trespassing. I have just taken legal ownership of my property, and the former occupants are refusing to vacate." The next hour was a blur of frantic, whispered arguments from them, pathetic attempts at last-minute emotional blackmail, and threats of legal retribution. I ignored it all. I sat in an armchair, with the footlocker of my mother's letters at my feet, and I waited. When the 2 police officers arrived, I met them at the door with a calm demeanor and a file of paperwork, the will, the deed, and my ID. I explained the situation concisely and without emotion. Susan and Mark tried to interrupt, their voices shrill with accusations that I was unstable, that I was grieving and not thinking clearly. The officers listened patiently, their faces impassive. But the paperwork was undeniable. One of them turned to Susan and Mark. "Ma'am, sir, I'm sorry, but this is her house. You are going to have to leave the premises." The public, official declaration of my victory was the most vindicating moment of my life. The sight of them being escorted out of my mother's home, their faces a mixture of impotent rage and utter humiliation, was the beginning of my freedom. They grabbed their coats, sputtering threats, and were led out the front door. As the door clicked shut behind them, the silence they left in their wake was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The silence that followed their expulsion was profound. It wasn't an empty silence, it was a cleansing one, the kind of quiet that follows a violent storm. For the first time in 15 years, the air in the house felt like it was mine to breathe. Liam locked the front door and engaged the deadbolt, the sound of the metal sliding into place echoing like a proclamation. It was over. He turned to me, his face etched with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. I thought about the question for a moment. Was I okay? No, but I was going to be. "I am now," I said, and the words felt truer than anything I had ever spoken. The first thing I did was walk through the house, room by room, as if I were a stranger visiting for the first time. I was reclaiming my territory. Every object, every piece of furniture, seemed to be tainted with their presence. Susan's collection of porcelain dolls with their dead, staring eyes lined the mantelpiece. Mark's collection of video games and empty energy drink cans littered the room that was once my mother's studio. The beige, soulless art they had hung on the walls was an insult to the vibrant, creative woman they had worked so hard to erase. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to purge. To get them out of my space, not just physically, but spiritually. That night, Liam and I began the great exorcism. We found dozens of large black trash bags in the garage, and we started in the living room. Susan's dolls went into a bag, their frilly dresses and plastic smiles disappearing into the darkness. Mark's trophies for participation in sports he barely played were next. We stripped the beds of their linens, bagged up the clothes in their closets, and cleared the shelves of their cheap, meaningless knickknacks. It was ruthless, methodical, and deeply cathartic. We weren't just cleaning a house. We were dismantling a life built on lies. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had every lock on every door and window replaced. I didn't want a single key that they had ever touched to still work. I then called Mr. Abernathy, the lawyer who had handled the will, and explained the situation. He was a dry, no-nonsense man, but I could hear a note of something that sounded like approval in his voice. He advised me on the legalities of handling their abandoned property and put me in touch with another lawyer who specialized in harassment cases, just in case. "It's always better to be prepared," he'd said. "People like that don't go away quietly." In the afternoon, I ventured back into the attic. This time, it didn't feel like a place of secrets and sorrow. It felt like a sanctuary. I carefully packed up all of my mother's letters, her sketchbooks, and her art supplies. I brought down her paintings. The ones Susan had claimed were in storage, but had simply been shoved into a dark corner under a leaking pipe. Some were slightly damaged, but they were still beautiful, still vibrant, still hers. I leaned them against the living room wall, and for the first time, the room started to feel like a home. It was a home filled with ghosts, but for the first time, they were my ghosts. They were the ghosts I wanted to live with. That evening, after a local charity had come and hauled away 24 bags of Susan and Mark's belongings, I found a small, locked metal box in the back of my father's desk drawer. It was the one place we hadn't yet cleared. After a bit of work with a screwdriver, the lock popped open. Inside, there were no sentimental keepsakes. There were just financial statements. Bank ledgers showing regular, significant cash withdrawals and wire transfer receipts to an account in Mark's name. The dates on the transfers lined up perfectly with every manufactured crisis, every failed business venture, every time I had been forced to send money. It was all there, in black and white. The proof of Mark's decade-long blackmail. My father hadn't just been a liar, he had been a willing and active paymaster in my emotional and financial extortion. The last vestiges of any complicated feelings I had about him, any lingering sense of daughterly duty, evaporated in that moment. He wasn't a tragic figure. He was just a pathetic, cruel man who had built a cage for my mother and then spent the rest of his life making me pay for it. With the house secured and the immediate threat removed, my focus shifted from the past to the future, a future my mother had tried to guarantee for me. The last letter she wrote, the one I found first, mentioned a lawyer she had retained, a name separate from my father's world. His name was Arthur Finch, and his office was in Portland, Oregon. Finding him was surprisingly easy. A quick search online revealed a small, reputable firm. My hands were shaking when I dialed the number, half expecting it to be a dead end, another piece of my mother's hope that had faded over time. But a warm, professional voice answered, and when I asked for Mr. Finch, I was put right through. "This is Arthur Finch," a kind, elderly voice said. I took a deep breath. "My name is Nora. My mother was Eleanor Vance. She told me to contact you. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then a soft, knowing sigh. Nora, he said, and the way he spoke my name felt like a gentle embrace. I've been waiting for your call for a very long time. We spoke for over an hour. Arthur was more than a lawyer. He had been my mother's friend, her only confidant in her exiled life. He filled in the gaps that the letters couldn't. He told me about her quiet bravery, her resilience, and the profound, all-consuming grief she carried for me. He described how she would come to his office every year on my birthday to sign the paperwork for the trust, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. He had seen the school photos she treasured. He knew about Stardust, the purple carousel horse. He was the one who had helped her draft that final, desperate letter, and he had been deeply troubled when he learned it had never reached me. His validation was a balm on my raw, wounded soul. He confirmed everything. The trust fund was real. My mother, a woman my father had painted as flighty and irresponsible with money, had been a meticulous and disciplined saver. She had funneled a portion of every paycheck she ever earned into that account. It was her life's work, a tangible manifestation of her love and her desperate hope that I would one day be free. Arthur explained that the trust was set to mature on my 30th birthday, but given the extreme circumstances, the fraud, the emotional abuse, the clear evidence of my father's malicious intent, they was confident he could get the funds released to me immediately. The amount she had managed to save was staggering. It wasn't a king's ransom, but it was more than enough to change my life completely. It was enough to pay off my student loans, to quit the 2 jobs I was working to make ends meet, and to finally, for the first time in my life, have the freedom to choose my own path. After the call, I sat in silence, trying to process the magnitude of it all. My mother hadn't just left me. She had spent 15 years building me a life raft. While my father, Susan, and Mark were actively draining my resources, my mother had been on the other side of the country, silently building me a future. It was the ultimate act of maternal love, a love that had transcended lies, distance, and even death. Later that week, a package arrived from Arthur's office. It contained all the official documents for the trust fund, but tucked inside was a small personal envelope. In it was a single photograph I had never seen before. It was of my mother, standing on a windy beach, the Pacific Ocean behind her. She was older than in my memories, her face lined with a sadness I could now understand, but she was smiling. It was a genuine, beautiful smile. On the back, in her familiar script, she had written, "For my Nora, may you always find your own ocean. I love you forever." I held the photograph to my chest and cried. They were not tears of sadness or anger. They were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude for the mother I had finally, truly found. Just as Mr. Abernathy had predicted, Susan and Mark did not go away quietly. Their defeat at the house was merely the end of the first battle, not the war. Once the initial shock wore off, the campaign of harassment began. It started with phone calls, dozens of them a day, from blocked numbers. I'd answer, and it would be Susan, her voice alternating between a syrupy, manipulative sweetness and a shrill, accusatory rage. She'd plead with me, telling me they had nowhere to go, that they were staying in a cheap motel, that she was worried about her health. "How could you do this to us, Nora, after everything we did for you?" We were a family. When the pleading didn't work, the threats would start. She'd accuse me of stealing from them, of trying to ruin their lives. Mark's approach was less direct but more unnerving. He would send a barrage of cryptic one-word text messages. "Thief. Liar. You'll regret this." It was a childish, pathetic attempt to get under my skin, to pull me back into their chaotic orbit of drama and dysfunction. Initially, each call and text felt like a small invasion, a fresh prick on a healing wound. They were trying to reassert the control they had lost, to prove that they could still affect me. Liam, ever my rock, helped me see it for what it was, the desperate flailing of cornered animals. Following Arthur Finch's advice, I documented everything. I took screenshots of the texts and kept a log of the calls. Then, I had my new lawyer draft a formal cease and desist letter. It was sent via certified mail to the motel where they were staying. The letter was clear and legally binding. Any further contact would be considered harassment, and I would pursue a restraining order. The letter seemed to work, at least for a while. The calls and texts stopped, but their silence was, in some ways, more unnerving than their noise. I knew they wouldn't give up that easily. Their next move was to weaponize the rest of the family. My phone started ringing again, but this time it was aunts, uncles, and cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. They had all received a carefully curated sob story version of events from Susan. In her telling, I was a cold, cruel, and mentally unstable monster who, in a fit of grief-induced rage, had thrown my poor, grieving stepmother and stepbrother out of their home with nothing but the clothes on their backs. I was painted as the villain, and they, of course, were the innocent victims. Some of the relatives were cautious, asking gentle questions, trying to understand my side of the story. To them, I explained the situation calmly and factually. But many of them had already made up their minds. They lectured me about forgiveness, about the importance of family, about how my father would be so disappointed in me. One of my uncles actually told me, "Whatever your issues are, Nora, you don't air your family's dirty laundry in public." It was Susan's favorite line, parroted back to me by people who had no idea how filthy the laundry truly was. It was a painful, isolating experience, but it was also clarifying. It showed me that their definition of family was a toxic covenant of silence and denial. I refused to be a part of it. I stopped answering their calls. I blocked their numbers. I drew a hard, clear line in the sand. My family was not the group of people I shared DNA with. My family was Liam. It was the memory of my brave, loving mother. It was my new friend, Arthur Finch. I was building a new family, one based not on obligation or secrets, but on truth, trust, and genuine affection. The final, pathetic attempt came in the form of a legal challenge to the will. They hired a lawyer and claimed that my father was not of sound mind when he wrote it, that I had unduly influenced him. It was a laughable, desperate Hail Mary, and it went nowhere. Miss Abernathy shut it down so quickly and decisively that it was almost anticlimactic. Their challenge was dismissed, and they were left with nothing but their legal bills. That was the last I heard from them. They had exhausted all their ammunition. They had tried manipulation, intimidation, social pressure, and legal action. Every tool in their toxic toolbox had failed. For the first time in my life, I was completely and totally immune to them. The war was finally over. I had won. 6 months later, the house was unrecognizable. The oppressive beige on the walls was gone, replaced by a warm, inviting shade of blue that reminded me of the ocean in my mother's photograph. The cheap, impersonal furniture Susan had favored was sold or donated, and in its place were pieces that Liam and I had picked out together, things that felt like us. But the most significant change was the art. My mother's paintings were everywhere. Her vibrant, expressive canvases filled the walls, breathing life and color back into the space she had once been forced to abandon. The largest piece, a stunning abstract landscape of swirling blues and golds, hung proudly over the fireplace where Susan's dead-eyed dolls used to sit. The house was no longer a crime scene. It was a gallery, a living tribute to her spirit. My life, too, had been completely transformed. With the money from my mother's trust, I had paid off every penny of my student debt. The sense of freedom was indescribable. I quit my 2 jobs, leaving behind the exhaustion of juggling night shifts and weekend retail. For the first time since I was a teenager, I had time to think, to breathe, to heal. I spent a lot of that time in my mother's old studio. Mark's posters were long gone, the walls were freshly painted, and the beautiful north-facing light once again filled the room. I had unpacked all of her art supplies, the charcoal pencils, the dried tubes of paint, the worn brushes. I wasn't an artist like her, but being in her space, surrounded by her tools, made me feel closer to her than ever before. Inspired by her story and the complex legal battle I had endured, I enrolled in classes to become a paralegal with a focus on family law and victims advocacy. It felt right. It felt like I was taking the pain I had been through and turning it into a purpose, a way to help others navigate the same dark waters I had almost drowned in. Liam and I were stronger than ever. He had been my anchor through the storm, and now we were enjoying the calm together. We'd spend our evenings cooking in the kitchen my mother had designed, looking out at the garden she had planted. We were building a life of peace and honesty, in the very place that had once been defined by secrets and lies. We were redeeming it, making it our own. One sunny afternoon, I was in the garden, weeding a patch of overgrown roses my mother had planted years ago. My hands were covered in dirt, the sun was warm on my back, and I felt a sense of peace that was so profound it almost made me cry. The ghosts were still there, but they were no longer menacing. The ghost of my father was a sad, pathetic figure I could almost pity. The ghosts of Susan and Mark were powerless, banished to the outer darkness of my life. But the ghost of my mother was a warm, loving presence. She was in the paintings on the walls, in the flowers in the garden, in the strength I felt in my own heart. I had not just reclaimed a house, I had reclaimed my life, my history, and my future. I had finally, after a lifetime of being told to be strong for others, learned how to be strong for myself. And that was the greatest inheritance she could have ever left me. It's strange to think about how my life was built on a foundation of lies, a carefully constructed stage play where I was the only actor who didn't know their lines were fake. For 15 years, I played the part of the grieving daughter to a man who was not a widower but a kidnapper of the soul. I was the responsible, difficult child in a family that was not a family at all, but a small, desperate cult of personality built around my father's fragile ego and Susan's quiet ambition. They operated on a transactional definition of love, and for years I was their most reliable and profitable asset. Now, the play is over. The stage has been dismantled, and the actors have been cast out into the real world to face the consequences of their roles. I don't know where Susan and Mark are, and I have no desire to find out. They are spectres from a life that is no longer mine. My vindication wasn't loud or explosive. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was the quiet, steady work of reclamation. It was changing the locks. It was painting over a beige wall. It was hanging my mother's art in the sunshine. It was the profound peace of waking up in a house that is truly my own, next to a man who saw my truth even when I couldn't see it myself. It was funding my own future with a love that was strong enough to cross a decade and a half of silence. My father didn't leave me the house as a final act of love or a pang of guilt. I see that clearly now. He left it to me as one last act of chaos, a final, posthumous attempt to pit us all against each other. He probably imagined I would sell it and be forced to give Susan and Mark a cut, or that I would be too weak to stand up to them, forever tying me to their toxic orbit. He never imagined I would have the strength to burn it all down and build something new and beautiful from the ashes. He underestimated me. They all did. They mistook my compliance for weakness and my silence for acceptance. They never understood that the entire time they thought they were making me weaker, they were actually forging me into the one thing they couldn't control. My family now is not defined by blood, but by choice. It's Liam, who taught me that love is about validation, not obligation. It's Arthur, who honored my mother's memory and fought for my future. And it's my mother, Eleanor, a woman I know better now in death than I ever did in life. Her love is the foundation of my new home, the bedrock upon which my real life is built. I took the truth, and I used it to set myself free. So now I have to ask you. In cutting them off completely, in refusing any path to reconciliation, and in taking back every single thing they thought they were entitled to, did I go too far or not far enough?